Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. We've given just a little extra time in case anyone was running a little bit late. My name is Mike Richardson. I'm the Director of Support with Cities Digital, and I'm going to be covering today a webinar on Laserfiche upgrades and server migration processes. We have this come up quite frequently as a request to have servers migrated or to perform upgrades. And there's always seems to be kind of a series of questions that go along with that, and each circumstance is unique, but we're going to try to cover the basics of what exactly entails an upgrade in a server migration process. Okay, here we go. All right, so the purpose of this webinar is going to be to give you the information that you'll need in order to understand the upgrade and migration processes for Laserfiche. And the topics that we're going to cover are the procedures when considering an upgrade or a server migration. So on the agenda today, we have reasons to consider an upgrade or migration, things to consider first before upgrading or migrating, new server preparation, migrating volume data, migrating SQL data, virtualization, activation, deactivation, RIO systems, unattended client installs, and new major release recommendations. And of course, the ever-present bonus inclusion, best ways to utilize self-help resources and how to help Cities Digital Support help you when you require support. Okay, so there's several reasons why you might want to consider upgrading or migrating. One of the first ones is that you're 3 or more major builds behind. The current release is version 10 that just came out at the conference literally about a week and a half ago. We're not necessarily pushing version 10 quite yet as something that we should jump right into. Normally we give that a couple of months to allow them to come out with a service pack if there are any small bugs that need to be worked out. So for the purposes of this conversation, we're going to consider 9.2 as the most current version. So when you're 3 or more major builds behind, and major builds are the 8.3, not literally 8.3.2. So for instance, if you're on 9.1, and I wrote this before 10 came out, so obviously there's no 9.4, but let's just say you're on 9.1 and 9.4 has been released, then that's the point in time when you should probably look to perform an upgrade. The other instances that will be reasons to upgrade or migrate is it will resolve a problem. That's pretty obvious. If Laserfiche recommends that you upgrade because you're having a specific issue, and the only way to really resolve that without a workaround that's too intrusive would be to upgrade. So that would be a point in time that we definitely want to consider an upgrade. Another point at which we would do this would be some new functionality. So if this new version that we have contains functionality that you're going to use but isn't present in your specific version that you're on now, then that would be a point in time that we would want to consider an upgrade as well. Just because there's new functionality that you may not use, but it'd be nice to have. I'm not sure that I would really recommend an upgrade in that particular instance unless you're actually going to be using that specific functionality. So what we don't want to do is to create more problems than we resolve if we upgrade and there's a more pressing issue than what we actually resolve by doing the upgrade or got functionality in place that you may not even use. The other specific instance in which I would consider an upgrade would be when you're installing a new product. So for instance, if you have forms that you just purchased and you're on version 9.1, it's probably a good idea to go ahead and upgrade to 9.2 so that we can be on the latest version of forms when you start building them. It really wouldn't be a good idea to start building forms in version 9.1 and then later have to migrate to 9 or 10 or whatever the case may be. Also, I just wanted to mention about questions. You can certainly ask questions during the webinar. I am going to make a PDF of this slide presentation. It will be available, and we're going to put it out on our FTP site for you to be able to get, and possibly other locations, and I will make sure that I give that information out at the end of the webinar. Let's see, we have a question here. This webinar is being recorded, So we'll have that also after the edits are done for you to be able to view. All right, so the more reasons to consider upgrading or migrating would be that your system is performing poorly. So although the upgrade may not resolve your problem, a migration to a new server or updating the resources on the present server may have an impact. And if the SQL is on the same server as Laserfiche, consider breaking it off to improve performance. That's one of the key factors when you are having performance issues, is if SQL is on the same machine as your Laserfiche server. That's the first thing we'd want to do is to break that off onto another server or VM if possible. That should dramatically improve performance. If you're in that situation, it's definitely something that we should look at doing. And lastly is that the server OS or the SQL version is no longer supported. So if you're running a OS, for example, 2003, on your server that's no longer supported by new versions of Laserfiche, which is entirely true at this point for 2003, that would be a point in time that we should look to upgrade. The version of SQL is no longer supported by a newer version or product. So if you're on SQL 2005 and you buy forms, we really wouldn't have an option but to put 2008 in place or use a SQL Express instance of 2008, which is not optimal, but is possible if moving up to a newer version of SQL isn't possible. Consider what the minimum requirements are now and what they're likely to be soon, and perhaps make a leap to the newest versions and ahead of the curve. So when we're looking at a server migration, and you're presently on SQL 2008 R2 and you have a 2014 instance of SQL, we're going to go ahead and migrate that anyway. We might as well make that leap over to the 2014 server and stay ahead of the ever-present curve of software that's being retired. So it would be a good time to look at doing that. All right, so some things that we're going to consider first before we do the migration or an upgrade would be splitting servers. So the Laserfiche system is not operating at peak efficiency, for example, and you may want to consider splitting products up and grouping them according to resource usage onto their own virtual machines. So for instance, if you have the Laserfiche and workflow and import agent all on one machine, and SQL's on another machine and you're still having performance issues because you have a heavy workload with workflow, perhaps at the time that we're doing the migration or the upgrade, we should also look at splitting workflow off onto its own server so that it has its own resources and isn't detracting from Laserfiche's server's ability to perform on its own. Let's see, new volume locations. So space considerations may require moving or splitting volumes to more than one location. So when we're moving, migrating, upgrading, or just have a problem with space, we just need to know that the volumes do not have to be in the same location, especially if they're rollover volumes. So if we have our rollover volume set to a specific location on a server or a SAN and it's run out of space, we can adjust that to use a second SAN or a second set of space during the time that we perform the upgrade or migration or just necessitates having to do that. We can set it up to roll over to a new location. All right, so some of the things to consider also first before doing the migration or upgrade is custom code, scripting, or integrations. So we need to know what kind of custom code, scripts, or integrations, and if they work with the new versions, they may be affected by an upgrade. We need to create some documentation if none exists. This is a potential problem and has been something that we've run into in the past where a customer or a third party has the SDK, for example, the software development toolkit from Laserfiche, and has created their own custom code or integration that we're not aware of. And the person that created it is either no longer with the company or is otherwise engaged somewhere else, and no one really understands that this code is in place. Perform the upgrade, and suddenly some critical function that no one really understood was in the background no longer works. So it is kind of critical to document anything outside the box that's being done by someone other than us, so that we know that it exists and we can run some tests if necessary to make sure that it will perform. Okay, so older products used in conjunction with Laserfiche. We also need to know the abilities of an external product integrated with Laserfiche and its ability to work with the version of Laserfiche that you upgrade to. For instance, a product called Eden, made by Tyler Technologies, and I'm just using this as an example, isn't compatible with Laserfiche 9.2, but will work with 9.1, which limits the ability to upgrade to the newest version. So since we don't necessarily contact Tyler Technologies in advance, and you may have your own contract with them, it's imperative that we know all of these pieces that are in the background that work with Laserfiche, which kind of goes back to the custom code scripting integrations from a third party that will interact with Laserfiche, so that we can make sure that it is compatible, and that we're not going to upgrade and create a larger situation than the one we were trying to remedy. Some more things to consider are the minimum operating system and SQL versions. So we want to look, does the present server or the new server meet the minimum OS and SQL requirements for the new Laserfiche product or version? There are certain, as I mentioned before, certain products of Laserfiche, such as forms, that will require SQL 2008 when the rest of Laserfiche will work with 2005. We need to know just what we have, what we will have, and whether or not it's compatible with the new versions of Laserfiche that we're looking to migrate to. We want to plan the client workstation upgrades. We want to know how and when you will upgrade the workstations so that they're using the same version of the software as the server will be on. This is another potential and has been something we've run into before, where we do an upgrade to, let's say, 9.2 from 8.3, and the customer has 60-some workstations, 32 of which get upgraded, and the rest are still running the older client, which will work. Well, eventually you run into something that just doesn't work quite right, and the obvious thing that we're going to check after some troubleshooting and figuring out that you have a newer server version is going to be upgrade that client, and in most cases that's going to fix the problem. So the recommendation and best practice is pretty obvious. We always want to have the clients, if we have thick clients, on the same version as the Laserfiche server, which will ease the troubleshooting process for both you and us. All right, we want to make sure that we have credentials used in product configurations. So we want to ensure that we know what credentials are being used and replicate them to any new server or SQL instances that we may have when we're doing a migration. It'll be an ideal time to create a system map for future use. This is another slowdown that I encounter quite frequently when we're doing specifically server migrations, is that the domain credentials that we have in the background running the Laserfiche server or forms or workflow, nobody seems to know those credentials anymore, and they've been active on the SQL server for some time. So when we go to do the installation, we're hunting down credentials now, and that really delays the entire process, and we can't move forward until we have those credentials. So before we do the upgrade, it might be a very good time to kind of map out how things are connected, what credentials are being used, and make sure that we either have replacement credentials or that we have the original credentials to be able to streamline the process. Okay, so third-party applications that integrate with Laserfiche, that kind of goes back to the Eden thing, but this is more general. If there are applications designed and built by a third party, be sure to check with those resources to ensure that they will operate with the new version. There have been instances when a third-party application has not been upgraded to work with a newer version, and the result is we're not able to perform the Laserfiche upgraded, or it's been upgraded to a lower version than the most current release. And obviously, in the worst case scenario with this would be that we perform the upgrade and everything works spectacularly except for some obscure third-party program that was written in 1947 using, I don't know, punch cards or whatever was the case back then, only to figure out that it will not work with the newest version. So we've spent a couple hours of your time doing the entire upgrade and testing, only to have to roll everything back to, the way that it was before we even started the upgrade, which essentially, spent a lot of time for nothing. It's fairly rare that that's the case, but it has happened in the past, so I just want to make sure that everyone's aware of that potential. Okay, new server preparation. So one of the things that we want to do in preparation for this is to be sure that UAC, which is user account controls, and the antivirus is off, if possible. It's not always possible, but it will ensure a smooth installation. You can turn these items back on after the installation is complete. There have been cases with specific antiviruses and UAC in particular that have caused us to have to go back and figure out why something isn't working correctly and basically turn UAC off and run a repair and then everything's fine. But getting to that point might take 20 or 30 minutes to try to discover what that possibility may be. So turning those off in advance, because turning UAC off would require a reboot. And just a note about UAC as well. If you're on server 2012, you need to turn that off in the registry. Turning it off through the control panel is not going to work. So just having that done in advance will save us some time and potential troubleshooting steps. IIS and message queuing roles and features. The IIS role will need to be installed on all of the servers, as most of the Laserfiche products use web-based processes now. Features are ASP, ASP.NET, all versions 3.5 and 4.5. Windows authentication, and IIS6 compatibility. Those are the features of that role that need to be on. For workflow servers, we also need the message queuing feature installed. And generally, when I put out a calendar invitation to you to do these upgrades or migrations, I will include this in the calendar invitation, so there's really not a need to know this right off the top. But when we do that, just be sure to check the calendar invitation for the instructions that are in there. Service accounts. Be sure that you have any domain service accounts that are set up that will facilitate communication with SQL or other products. That goes back again to making sure that you have a system map, if possible, with all the credentials. And you would want to make a service account used for Windows authentication between Laserfiche and SQL. A local administrator on the Laserfiche server or servers, if you have more than one, so that when we do the installation, we would want to log in as that domain account to do the installation and to facilitate the communication with SQL. All right, I'm going to kind of take a small break here because I've been going a little bit quickly. Last time I did this, it took over an hour and everybody was saying I went too slow. So I'm going to pause here and ask if anyone has any questions so far that we can answer before going on. I'm not seeing any questions, so I guess that means I can continue. All right. So, migrating volume data. Where to put the data on a new server. All right, so what we would like to do is to try to keep the path to the data on the volumes the same. So for instance, if it presently belongs to a folder called DLF data volumes, you want to try to keep that location the same on the new server to avoid having to change the paths and the volumes in the admin console later. This isn't a massive concern, but it can be kind of a drag to have to go back, especially if you've got, 150 volumes to try to have to change all of those paths for no other reason than I like an E drive, not D anymore. So if it's possible, you can save yourself and a lot of time by trying to keep those paths the same. If the paths are on the C drive, which has happened several times in the past, I would recommend that you do not put your volumes on the same partition as your OS. So at that point, it would be a good idea to go ahead and change those to either a UNC location or to the D drive or an E drive that you set up on the new server. All right, so now would be a good time when migrating the volume data to split volume locations if necessary. So we talked about this briefly before. If the volumes are too large to fit on one driver of SAN, then we can go ahead at this time and split them up onto several different locations and change the paths to the volumes in the admin console. But we just want to make sure that we have a plan to where those new volumes should reside, and obviously a backup plan, because now you're splitting them to two different locations, and we want to make sure that we're backing all of that up on both of those locations. Migrating volume data would also be a good time to split the SQL server onto its own server, as we discussed briefly before. It is best practice to have the SQL server on a different server other than the Laserfiche server or workflow server or anything else. Specifically non-Express installs. If you have SQL Express, it really doesn't matter because it's limited to the amount of resources it's going to be able to use anyway. This is done to improve the performance of the Laserfiche system. An upgrade or migration is an ideal time to do this, as well as upgrade SQL to a newer release if you'd like to do that. So I always kind of discuss that when I have my pre-migration discussion, where SQL is located. Do you want to go ahead and get it up to a new version? Do we want to split it off right now to make things a little bit faster? So that's a perfect time to do that. All right, migrating the SQL databases. When we're migrating the SQL databases, we want to turn off all the Laserfiche services before we start migrating anything. We want to be sure to turn off all the Laserfiche services before migrating the Laserfiche database so that no activity can occur during the backup or detach process. What we want to avoid here is a scanner in some odd location who's happily scanning their documents into Laserfiche, and we begin a transition of moving that database over and then reattaching it, only to discover, that person has done an hour's worth of work that is no longer now in the database that's been moved over. Same thing for workflow. Workflow's working on its own in the background, so we don't want it having doing any processes that might be affected by a SQL migration. Okay, so detaching and or backing up, restoring the database. You can perform the database move by detaching the database on the source server, moving the MDF and LDF files over to the destination server, and then attaching. That is not a preferred method for a couple of reasons. If you don't stop and the services and attach them correctly and make sure that everything is static when you detach them. For instance, we detach the workflow database with the Laserfiche server still running, or vice versa. There may be activity that it's still trying to perform in the background and is unable to, but the services are running, so you'll end up with a lot of errors in your event logs and different things. So I prefer the second method, which is you can also perform a backup of the database on the source server and restore it to the destination server as a means of migrating the database, and that way you have a backup copy still on your old server, your old SQL server, as well as when we attach or restore it over to the new server, it's there, and we can kind of compare things. If something goes wrong, we always have that copy that we can go back to, and it's still on the older version of Laserfiche if necessary. So just keep those in mind. You cannot just copy the MDF and LDF files, even if the MDF and LDF files, which are the SQL database, both those files make one SQL database, were copied with the volume. You must either perform a detach or move function, the move function above, backup and restore process, in order for the database move to be successful. Basically what that means is that while the SQL database is running, you can't just, even if the MDF and LDF files for the database are in the volume folder that you're moving over, once I get in there, the first thing I'm going to do is delete those, and then I'm going to go over to the SQL server and back up the database and then restore it to the same location on the new server. You can't just copy those files while things are running. You have to do it via one of these two methods of detaching or backup and restore. So I'm going to pause here for a moment to see if we have any questions regarding this particular topic that we've covered. I see somebody raised their hand, but I don't see a question. Mike O'Neill raised his hand. You can ask a question if you like. All right, let's see what we got here. So you have to migrate the files first and then move the database. Well, that's a good question. I think we're about to get to the migration of the files, but typically moving the volume files takes a very long time. So if you have, let's say, for instance, 300 gigabytes worth of volume files, those are going to take a lot longer to move than 300 gigabytes of just zip files would, because you have millions of little TIFF files. So I typically ask that the volume files be migrated first before we mess with any of the database stuff. And as a rule, I will help you with the database move because it doesn't take very long. But yes, the answer to the question is I would move the volume files first, and then we can move the database. When you move the volume files, though, you don't want any activity going on. So if you have 300 gigs worth of volume files information to move, and it's going to take, let's say, 24 hours to do it, obviously you're not going to be able to do that during one night session. So what we might look to do is schedule this for a Friday evening to move all of the data files over, and then schedule the actual migration process for Monday morning so that you can turn the services off and then won't have anybody in the repository attempting to add or change anything while that copy process is going on. Okay, let's see. When shutting down the Laserfiche services, how can I ensure no data is lost from scanners, forms, input, quick fields, agents, etc.? Well, I mean, obviously, you'd want to shut down the services at a time when nobody's in the system, so I would probably schedule some downtime and say the system is going to be shut off at X hour or whatever on a Friday evening, and then roll that out and actually just turn the services off. There's really not a great answer to that question, because if you have activity going on constantly, you're just going to have to find a time to be able to bring it down. Let's see, does Laserfiche need to run its own SQL instance? Is the temp DB intensive? There's a whole host, and I can send these to you. There's a whole white paper on where you should put the temp DB and where you should put the MDF and where you should put the LDF on different types of drives, different types of RAID. We're not going to get into that on this particular topic here, but if you'd like to know what the best practices are for having those broken out, I'll be glad to send you that information. The answer is, to the question, does Laserfiche need to run on its own SQL instance? The answer is no, with an asterisk. If you have a SQL instance already in place and you have Exchange and some other heavy hitter program that's hitting it pretty hard, I would probably not put Laserfiche on there. But it is not. It does not have to have its own instance. It's probably better if it does. That way, it's a little cleaner for backups and everything else. But I have several larger customers that do share it even in a cluster. Let's see. In a virtual machine, is it possible to use the existing VMDK drive from the old machine and attach it to the new VM? Yes, if you have a SAN type drive that you're able to literally physically detach and then attach, or either software-wise, to the new VM, you can definitely do that, and that will save you a lot of time of having to copy the files from one location to another. I really enjoy the very few times, stressing very few times, that someone has had that capacity. But if you do, that will definitely save a lot of time. All right. I think we've answered those questions. So we're going to move on. All right, virtualization. So resource allocation for virtualization, ensure that that the resources are allocated properly and according to the function that the server is expected to perform. For instance, more processor cores for workflow servers and more RAM for the SQL server. Each particular product has its own likes. For instance, workflow servers are constantly evaluating threads to see if circumstances have changed so that it can move on to the next step, especially in conditional workflows. So it's ideal to have more processors on the workflow server than it would be to have a lot of RAM on that particular server. However, the inverse can be true for other products that we're going to be using, such as, SQL Server also likes cores, but not as much as it likes RAM. It will eat up every shred of RAM that you're going to throw at it. So when we have a SQL Server, it's ideal to give that a lot more RAM than anything else so it can perform its functions much faster than it would be to throw 8 cores at it and a low amount of RAM. So we want to make sure that we have the proper resource allocation. And if you're going to be putting all these products like Laserfiche, Workflow, Import Agent, Audit Trail, and so on one server, please understand that there are white papers out there for the specific to the Laserfiche server and specific to Workflow and specific to Audit Trail and so on that come with its own set of resource requirements. Those are cumulative. So if you put the Laserfiche server on there and the minimum is 2 gigs of RAM, and then you're putting workflow on there and its minimum is 2 gigs of RAM, and then you put something else which minimum of 2 gigs of RAM, those are cumulative. So you'll need at least 6 gigs of RAM to be able for it to perform correctly. That's the rule. Well, that's kind of a rule of thumb that I use. SQL is a little bit different, as I mentioned before. That's kind of a third-party product that Laserfiche doesn't support necessarily, but is required for the function of Laserfiche. So we would want to refer to the documentation for SQL and any other third-party application that we have there. And if you have any questions on resource allocation, I'll be more than happy to discuss those with you. It makes my job actually easier to get those right when we do the migration than to go back and have to relicense products and do all of that if we have to up the requirements later because they were set minimally. Okay, so we also want to utilize multiple VMs to split the workload. We touched on this a little bit before. To get the best performance out of your system, you might want to consider splitting heavy load products such as workflow and the full text search services to other VMs so that Laserfiche server is able to respond faster. This comes up, especially with SQL, needs to be on its own server, but going beyond that, if you have a 5-user system, for instance, it may not seem like a good idea to have 2 VMs for a 5-user system. However, if you're processing a lot of statements and things in the background that, an automated tasks, it may require that the workflow server be on another VM just to be able to keep up with the workload that it's expected to perform. So when we go to do these migrations or upgrades, it's probably a good time to take a look at what kind of workload that you're putting onto these servers and maybe think about the possibility of splitting some of this off. The full text index and search services are quite intense. If you've never had the need to use them, they're literally going page by page or text file by text file searching for the word the, in addition to the Laserfiche server and workflow server demanding resources to be able to function. So if you do a lot of full text searches or any of that, it might be a good idea to say, let's take a moment and think about how we can improve the performance by maybe setting up a small VM that's dedicated to nothing but searching, and that might make life a lot better. We also, the upgrade server migration events are an ideal time to virtualize. So when we're looking at doing an upgrade or a server migration, it's a really, really good time to take a look at our resource allocations and determine whether or not it would be an appropriate time to start splitting some of this off, because we're going to end up having to do an install anyway, whether that be on 2 servers or on 1 server. It's pretty much the same process. So might as well go ahead and take a look at that. We also want to assign like products to VMs. So when we're considering virtualizing, let's think about how best to assign the products to the VM infrastructure. like products, like web products such as web access and forms should go onto the same VM. So if you want to create a web VM to split off those particular products to its own server and also create a workflow server with full text and indexing on that, be your workhorse, and have a Laserfiche server with perhaps import agent and a couple, audit trail and all of that, we can split those resource allocations up and keep like products on the same servers. For instance, we have a workflow server and we also have quick fields that has automated tasks in the background. Those are performing the same sort of tasks. Maybe we should go ahead and just get another VM to put those two things on and keep the web products on a third VM so that everything has its own same type of server. I'm going to pause here for a second to see if we have any other questions. No? Okay. Let's continue. Okay, so activation, deactivation. This is a frequent occurrence, especially on the weekend. That seems to occur with people who are a little gung-ho, want to do the server upgrade or migration themselves, which is understandable and perfectly okay with me if you'd like to go down that route. But there are some things about activation and deactivation that we need to know. For instance, for Avante, Laserfiche Avante systems are allowed only one activation at a time. This means that it's not possible to use the activation key to pre-set up a new server without taking the current production environment offline. I get that question quite frequently. We want to go ahead and get Laserfiche installed and pre-ready for everything for a cutover. I can do that, but since you're only allowed one activation for the Avante server, Laserfiche server, I literally have to take production offline during the time that I'm doing the installation onto the to the new host for this server. So I have to take it offline, deactivate it over here, activate it on this one, get everything set up, and then I can deactivate that and put your licenses back into production. There are test licenses that are available if you really want to go that route. Laserfiche will issue a 30-day test license without too much complaint. So if you want to go ahead and pre-set up a Laserfiche server, that would be the ideal thing. However, that does take about a week or so to get into place. So we'd want to go ahead and get that request in early so we can get those issued. For Rio systems, Rio is allowed to have multiple Laserfiche servers at the same time, so setting up a new server beforehand is possible. Please be aware that some products are only allowed a certain number of activations, like quick fields, so not all products will be able to be activated in this manner on the new server without removing license from production environment. So even in the Rio license scheme, we can go ahead and set up a lot of the products, but there may be some, such as quick fields, that we would have to steal a license from somewhere in order to get it set up and activated. Quick fields is kind of a bad example because you activate it after the fact. So we could literally install quick fields but not have it activated. But let's just a little pre-planning on that just to make sure we have everything in place would save some time and heartache. United and Team, these are the old concurrency-based licenses system that we don't really have too many of anymore. Many of the older Team and United licenses allow for 2 activations at the same time. It may be possible to install another server license if there's a free activation. We need to check this Laserfiche support site and ask a support rep to check or ask us to check. There is a caveat to this. If you install the secondary license on the same domain, those 2 servers, because they have the same serial numbers, will start fighting each other for who's the right one to be on. So we have to. There's a little bit of pre-work that we need to do to make sure that that doesn't happen during the middle of the day when everybody's trying to do something. All right, we have a question. Let's see. If upgrading version to a new servers, does the old database need to be on a new SQL server during the upgrade or to update the schema? Let me see if I understand this. If upgrading version to a new service, does the old database need to be on the new SQL server during the upgrade to upgrade the schema? Okay, so if we're migrating SQL as well, we definitely, and the very first thing that I'm going to do is to make a backup copy of your database as it exists the moment before we do anything else. That way, if I have to roll backward for whatever reason, I can do so. The answer to the question is you really do need to have at least a backup of it, because when we connect the new version to the database, whether the database is being migrated or not, the schema will get upgraded, and there is no going back from that. So that's why I always make a backup copy of the database, or ask to make sure that we have one that's very recent, like literally minutes before we do this, so that if I have to roll backwards, we're not rolling backwards to a copy that's 3 days old and we lose a lot of work and changes. I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, please feel free to ask a more detailed question. Let's see here. Does anybody else have any questions before we move on about activations or anything else? Volumes? I know this is a lot of information. Okay, I don't see anything yet. So, all right, Rio considerations. For those of you who have Laserfiche Rio, what we probably should look to do that Avante and or United really aren't able to do, which is a great benefit to having a Rio system, is to set up a test environment. So Rio allows for multiple Laserfiche servers to be set up at the same time on the same domain, and since this ability exists, it's recommended that you set up a test server environment to pre-test upgrade and other processes, such as new workflows, before performing the action in the production environment. So basically what you're doing here is you're proving that the upgrade is viable, that it doesn't destroy anything, and while keeping your production environment online at the same time that we're testing all this. If you have Rio, I highly suggest you can do that. You can even set up multiple servers, like you can have a test system to perform testing on upgrades. You can also have a dev server for development to work on any kind of custom scripting codes that won't even affect the test system. And we can clone your database, your production database, so that each of these systems look identical to your production system. Now, we may not clone the volumes, because if you have a terabyte worth of stuff, we don't necessarily need to have it contain 3 terabytes across 3 servers, but we can clone the database so that your structure, all of your documents, all of your templates, all of your annotations, all of those things will carry over because they're in the database. Now, going a little bit further, for those of you who don't have Rio, again, that test server license is an option, but it's only going to be good for 30 days. And the clock starts ticking on the day that it's that they issue the license, not the day that we activate it. So in anticipation of that, if you'd like to set up a small test system to test your upgrades, we can do that on that basis. Okay, so upgrade the test environment to prove the upgrade success. As mentioned above, you can do a proof of concept for the upgrade process by upgrading the test environment using your production clone database and testing all aspects of the system without making or taking the production environment down. Updating the master license. When upgrading the Rio system or adding users to a Rio system, that's a little bit of an iffy area, but if you're upgrading, for sure, you'll have to update the master license so that it can issue licenses for the higher level versions of the products, as well as add the user license counts to the license database. You can find the information. There's a link there if you want to know more about that process. So when you're in the Rio License Manager, it's going to say something like maximum version 9.2. If we're going to go to 10, we need to update the master license, which isn't difficult, and I can help you with that. At the time we do the upgrade, it's not that big of a deal, so that the maximum version would be 10. And if you're updating user counts, then obviously you need to update the master license to update those user counts if you bought more users. And generally, when I send you the email that has the instructions in there, that's what it's going to say, is update the master license and give you instructions on how to do that. Does anybody have any questions about RIO considerations? No? All right, moving on. Client upgrades. I put a wonderful document out there on our FTP site. If you've never been to our FTP site, it is FTP city FTP dot citiesdigital.com/DL Delta Lima /LF Lima Foxtrot. If you go there, you'll see all of the products available for downloads, and also you'll see a training documentation area. Inside that training documentation area, there's a file in there called Installing the Laserfiche Client. It contains all of the information about what I'm about to present here, with batch files, with possible scenarios of installing the Laserfiche Client, what you should do, what you shouldn't do. But for the batch file, normally when I do an upgrade, I will either create, or I will send you the documentation on how to create a batch file that's produced that will contain all the necessary information to now allow an end user with local admin rights to perform the upgrade on a workstation. And I've got some information on the next slide for that. Basically, it's just a old school batch file that has the switches and everything contained in there to do the perform the upgrade on the client for you. Pushing the installation files. There are methods for creating a file that can be pushed out to workstations automatically using the batch file instructions as a base for the package. There are some customers that want to use MSI or different push types to push these upgrades out, and we can definitely do that. There are instructions on the Laserfiche support site for different methods of doing that, and we can also use the batch file as a basis for those push files as well. And all of that, again, is contained within that installing the Laserfiche client PDF out on our FTP site in the training documentation area. Also, UAC and Microsoft Office. So we want to ensure, if possible, that user account controls are turned off on the workstations that we're doing these upgrades on. This may require a reboot of the computer if it was on and was turned off. It's not absolutely necessary to have UAC turned off. However, there are products like Snapshot, which is a printer driver, and Microsoft Office integration that could be affected by UAC being on. And it won't be every machine. It'll be 1 out of every 20, but that one machine will bang our heads against the wall trying to figure out why this doesn't work, only to figure out UAC was on. So I always recommend that if you have a problem with the client install, turn UAC off, reboot if necessary, and run a repair on the client install, and that usually fixes everything. Let's see. Ensure that no Microsoft applications are open or running when you do the client install. This is a fairly common thing because there are add-ins that it wants to put into, let's say, Outlook or Office, Word, Excel, so on. And if you have Excel open or Outlook, it may not be able to put the add-in in there, and then you come back and you're like, everybody's got a Laserfiche tab except for me. Again, that may be because Outlook was open when we ran the client installer. So if you can just make sure that those are closed out when you do the upgrade to the client, usually that's going to keep you from having to deal with those scenarios. Okay, so new major releases of Laserfiche products. Why wait? Well, this is a great time to discuss this because 10 just came out. If a new major release of a product, such as WebLink 9.0 or Laserfiche 10, is released, it's generally recommended that customers wait a few months before installing it on anything other than a test system. The reasons for that are pretty obvious. You know, major releases that come out like version 10 tend to have these little things in there that aren't quite right because they haven't been introduced to the wider public until literally a week and a half ago. So I have my customers who are kind of pioneers and they like being on the bleeding edge, and that's fine. I'll definitely upgrade you to version 10. But you know, as long as you're willing to kind of work with us on any types of bugs that we may find, which I have to report, I've got a couple of instances of Laserfiche 10 out there right now for a couple of my pioneers, and so far so good. I'm still playing a little bit of the waiting game on that, but so far this looks to be one of the best you know, major releases that I've seen, so I'm very hopeful about that. I would still recommend that you might want to consider waiting at least until the first service pack comes out, or until maybe late March. Give it a couple months. Unexpected results. So the new release may fix something or provide some new feature that you want, but you could also cause unexpected issues that are worse than the problem that's being fixed or not worth the feature's gain. This would require a rollback to the previous version, which may come with its own set of challenges. So again, this goes back to basically upgrading for the sake of upgrading for no other reason than I want to be cool, you know, and on the coolest, latest version, which is fine by me. But there could be, you know, especially when you got third-party integrations and different things like that, there could well be something that creates a situation that might be a little bit worse than where we came from. So we want to be careful about how we do this, and test systems are really the way that we do that. Test servers, leading into that. Having a test server is ideal to test new releases. It's possible to get a 30-day test license for Avante systems, and Rio systems have the ability to have more than one Laserfiche server. It would be recommended to use a test system if you plan to install a new major release of a Laserfiche product. So if you'd like to go ahead and evaluate version 10, and you know, you want to do that on the basis of having a test system, let's do it. We'll go get the, especially if you got Rio, we'll set up a test server for you. We can also, like I said, get those test licenses. I'll be happy to assist you with, you know, updating to version 10 so we can evaluate it. I just wouldn't do it on the production system immediately. All right, here's my bonus. That means we're getting close. We're right at the end. Using the Laserfiche support site. There's a wealth of information on the support site that I think a lot of people don't even know is there. The Laserfiche support site contains a wide range of white papers, knowledge base articles, and they even have an answer section. So if you have a question that's not necessarily related to support, maybe you have something like, I built a workflow and this particular piece of the workflow is not doing exactly what you want it to do, those would typically go to our consulting department, which is generally a billable service, but you can also go out on the Laserfiche site and ask these questions in the answers forum, and the wider Laserfiche community can respond with their experiences and tell you maybe where you're going wrong. I think it's underutilized, and it's definitely something, if you haven't taken a look at it, you might want to. Laserfiche Answers is a place you can ask any type of question and get answers from not only other users but from Laserfiche themselves. And there's a link right there. If you've never checked it out, you might want to go and look at it. We actually refer to it on occasion if there's a question that we don't necessarily know the answer right away to. It's probably been asked before, so we'll just kind of pop in there and see if it's been asked before and if there's any resolution. A lot of the time, Laserfiche pre-sales folks will answer the questions, so they're not coming directly from users. It's definitely a great place to look at. The online help files contain an extensive information on not only requirements for a module, but how to use the module effectively. You can find the online help files for the products listed there. There's a link. It literally, a lot of the time when I get asked a question about security or something else, I will literally go to the help files and explain the answer, and also put a link into the help files and say you can look up more information here. So a lot of the answers that you're looking for are out on the help files, which you can search for, or search against, I should say. All of the activation keys and the product information is also available on the Laserfiche support site. You must register as a user before the information is available to you. And you can do so by going to this link right here. This is another thing that most people don't even realize is out there. You can literally look at your licenses, see how many users you have, see your activation keys. There's a wealth of information about your particular license structure and everything else on the support site that you can get to. You can also go, if you want to get like the absolute latest release of, you know, Scan Connect or whatever, they also have a download section, and once you've registered, you can go there and download it directly from Laserfiche. Of course, you can still use our FTP site too, but it is an option. And one last thing here. There are resources available on the Cities Digital FTP site that can help with common problems, as well as training documentation for certain products. Here's the link to our FTP site with the training documentation. If you want to find out information on how to install Laserfiche client properly, in addition to other helpful training documents, I've got like introduction to security, workflow, quick start guides, all kinds of stuff out there. If you go to the other area here on this other link on our webinar docs, you will find all of the webinar documentation, including this one after I'm finished, for previous topics. And of course, this document will be sent to that location shortly after the conclusion of this event. So I've got several out there, one of which is backing up the Laserfiche system. That entire webinar's documentation's out there. I also have fixing common scanner problems. So any potential scanner issue that you run into, that webinar document's out there with links and screenshots and everything else. It's a really helpful document. Okay, we are concluded now, so if you have any questions or need any answers, I'm ready to take them.